For me, the Imperial Fists might be the most important chapter in all of Warhammer history. They birthed the Black Templars, featured on the 3rd edition launch set from 1998, and the Crimson Fists, the cover art for the 3rd edition Marine Codex. Non-Ultramarines poster boys, take me back. Of course, the Imperial Fists themselves are the true daddies, masters of fortification, unbroken and bright yellow. My name's Nick, this is Miniature Death, and we're gonna paint some. To create my little Fister Mister, I built a torso from the Intercessor kit as standard, just a stoic standing pose suited his demeanour. I then briefly superglued him onto the base for holding, which I can snap off later as needed. And then it's a choice of 2 power fists, cause I'm a very literal man. There's this left-handed option that's super chunky and square, in a closed fist with a big skull and crossbones. And then there's this right-handed version that's a bit more rounded, with open fingers and more techno gubbins. I compared the two against each other, checking rough poses, as well as figuring out which bolter arms would fit with which. Ultimately, I went with the left-handed version, paired with this one-handed aiming arm, with a shoulder pad already sculpted on. And I'm very sorry to say, I have no idea where either of these bits came from. If you know, please let me know in the comments. Why don't I know where they're from? Well, because they came from this bits box that I bought off Facebook Marketplace about 5 years ago. It's full of random sprues and arms and heads and all sorts of gubbins. Honestly, the best thing I've ever bought for my hobby. Top tip, sites like Facebook and Vinted are way better than eBay for finding random Warhammer bargains. Once my Imperial Fist had arms, he needed a head and a backpack. I do quite like the classic Mark 7 helmets, but ultimately I wanted some skin showing. I chose this rugged older gentleman as if he's been at war for centuries. For the backpack, I found this slightly ornate option, purely because it's more interesting than the Primaris version. I also wanted to pile on a few pouches, because I wanted it to look well equipped enough to last the siege. And then, I decided to add the classic Mark 7 helmet hanging off his belt at the back. I don't want my Marine to look pristine. I want him to look like he's been blasted and bombarded and struggling under siege for months. So, it's time to start adding battle damage. Using my hobby knife, I started drilling small holes where rounds have struck the armour. Only in places that make sense to take a hit, like his massive shoulder pads and shin guards. And I also added a few horizontal gouges to represent shots glancing off the surface. I even popped a hole into his helmet, as if he'd taken a headshot and then removed it. Finally, I started to build a slightly scenic base, using this bit of blasted wall from the Tau Darkstrider kit. I popped him off his superglued base, just to check he had room to stand, and then back on for painting. Why am I making the base in such a roundabout way? I don't know. I primed everything in white bone spray, with his head and backpack kept separate on bits of paperclip, and some standard grey for the base. I'm an idiot, and drilled right through his backpack while I was pinning it, so I swapped for this one, I think maybe from the Horus Heresy range? For painting, I went with the tried and true Imperial Fist technique, an undercoat of pink through the airbrush on all the downward facing surfaces. When I add a yellow contrast paint over the top, it'll create a lovely warm gradient in the shadows, and then just quickly re-establishing the highlights with pure white from above. And I also did the same pink and white combo on his head. Now, as I said earlier, I don't want my Marine looking squeaky clean, so I added in a little bit of Nazdrag yellow with my Imperial Fist contrast paint. This stuff through the airbrush is so satisfying. That pink undershade makes everything hazy and gritty, like a sunset on a dying world. Once the armour was base coated, I cracked out my regular brush and started blocking in the details, like his chest aquila in corn red, as well as the little helmet hanging off his belt at the back. I then used some Gore Grunter contrast fur on these little pouches. I love this paint over a warm base, it just makes a really worn leather look with zero effort. Now, for a slightly more delicate step, blocking in the shoulder trim with Dark Reaper, being careful not to spill onto the yellow, but don't worry too much, any small mistakes will be hidden with battle damage later. Some more Dark Reaper on his bolter, and then switching to pure Black Legion contrast paint for all those ridged, tubey bits around the back of his legs. This stuff right next to the yellow is almost impossible to do neatly, especially up around his crotch zone. And then some good old Surcoat Silver on all the metallic bits and weaponry, just picking those out carefully, bit by bit, not forgetting the details on his backpack of course. And last but not least, a quick coat of Pallid Witch Flesh on all the decorative scrolls. Lovely. And then things started to go south in several ways. It's like Dawn himself was testing my endurance. And I'm gonna look like a rubbish painter on camera, but that's showbiz, baby. I wanted to up the grim darkness and apply an oil wash. So I added a healthy coat of gloss varnish to help capillary action and protect the paint, as well as give it a nice smooth surface for decals. I actually wanted quite a few decals, one on the knee, both shoulder pads and a little shin script. So I started cutting those out and soaking them in water. But somehow, when it came to applying the decals, I noticed that my solutions were stripping the paint. I was using this Green Stuff World fixer and softener. Even through a layer of varnish, the contrast paint was getting smudged and rubbed off. Maybe I didn't leave the varnish to cure for long enough. I've never had this happen before. I really don't know what was going on. And honestly, this really cheesed me off. Not very stoic or heroic of me, not very Imperial fisty, but you know, them's the breaks. By the way, how do you pronounce decals? Because I say Decals, but I've noticed people like Jay from Eons of Battle say Decals, which sounds insane to me, but maybe that's the American or Canadian way of pronouncing it. I need to get to the bottom of this. If you can let me know in the comments, that would be great. This little shin detail somehow didn't strip any paint, but the knee and shoulder pad were kind of messed up. But I actually quite like the effect, so decided to keep them as is and see if I could work it into my battle damage later. Okay, time for take 2, and this time, things went more smoothly. I still hate applying decals to rounded surfaces like shoulder pads, but I got there in the end. And then came the oil wash, another step which I usually love and usually goes wonderfully, but somehow went all kinds of wrong. Must have added too much mineral spirits to my mix, because not long after I started applying the wash, it started to sort of split and leave this horrible gritty, gloopy texture. And again, I don't totally hate the vibe. It looks kind of like spattered mud and grease, but I didn't want it to do that. It wasn't behaving in a way that I like, even when I added more oil to the mix. Fortunately, oil paints are easy to clean up, so after an hour or so of drying, I could start carefully cleaning up the worst of the splitting while still leaving that grim texture in the recesses and leaving the larger surfaces lightly stained and smeared. Once I was relatively happy, I gave everything a mix of matte and satin varnish to dull the shine. And I finally got to the fun bit, battle damage. Well, technically I wanted to do a bit of manual highlighting first, applying Mephiston red to his chest aquila, as well as the iconic Mark 7 helmet hanging off his belt. But soon it was time to crack out the sponge and start adding chipping. I worked back and forth between Dryad Bark for dark speckles and Avalanche Sunset for light. Once I had a good spattering of sponge texture, I went in with my brush to add random dings and scratches. Sort of like edge highlighting, but not neatly, using this scratchy, choppy motion rather than smooth lines. I love this step because it takes no effort and easily increases readability and realism. Maybe I went too heavy on the damage? I don't know, you can decide. But what about his head? Well, nothing too crazy really. Just blocking in the armoured bits with more Dark Reaper and Surcoat Silver, adding a little bit of light grey to his beautiful beard, and then a healthy wash of Guilliman flesh all over. Top tip for painting bald lads, just quickly soap up the pooling on top of the head with a dry brush, and it'll basically highlight everything for you. Once that was dry, I just went back in to add some simple highlights to that wispy white beard, and working from Caliban green to Mook green in as smooth a gradient as I could manage by hand on his little eye lens doodad, before finishing off with that all-important single white dot. I also used a bit of that pure white to highlight his nose and forehead scar and service studs, a face only a mother could love. With his head and backpack in place, all this geezer needed was a base, so I slopped on some simple Astra granite, leaving some clear spots for his feet to be glued down, and then that got a wash of Agrat's Earthshade, some all-important pigment powders which I dusted up around his feet and that broken bit of wall, a single grass tuft, and a brown rim. Which finally brings me to this. Not one step back. Here he is in all his rugged and blasted glory, my grimdark Imperial fist. Believe it or not, this is my first Loyalist that I've ever painted, and honestly, I think maybe I like Space Marines now. I've got 9 more of these intercessors and a big old box of bits to get working through, so let me know in the comments what chapter I should paint next. My name's Nick, this is Miniature Death. Please give us a like and a subscribe, and go forth and fortify.